The Haftarah for Miketz focuses on King Solomon, one of the most famous of our ancestors, and the only one of our ancestors to rule as king over all 12 tribes of Israel. Now, this sets him apart from any of our other avot, the ancestors we call the original group of founders, and any of our ancestors after that who held ruling positions. Even his father, King David, and even Joseph, who of course was not the ruler of all Israel, but in fact a second in command in Egypt. So while we lift Solomon, King Shlomo HaMelech, into such a place of respect and honor through this week's Haftarah, when it's not Shabbat Hanukkah, we read about King Solomon from the Book of Kings. We do connect Solomon's greatness to the greatness of Joseph, in the sense that he indeed did accomplish and was appointed to royal status. And even though it wasn't in Israel, it is in service of other nations. It is in service of humanity, so that he could help save those who were in need from famine and hunger. And it, of course, is in service of his own people, for whom he makes a space in Egypt when life isn't possible in the kingdom of Israel, in Israel proper. And so one way to connect the Haftarah to our Parsha is to contrast Solomon, the greatest ruler of the Jewish people of all time, to the Joseph we know from Genesis, who, though he had his dreams, really never had everyone bowing down to him as king of Israel, like Solomon. And on the other hand, we can compare the greatness of King Solomon and Joseph within the history of our people, in the sense that they both accomplished a tremendous, tremendous sense of not only God's holy work in the world, but in reaching their positions that they served in their own times. The other aspect of featuring and highlighting both Joseph and King Solomon is to lift them both as important in stature among the ancestors of Israel, whom we ought to focus on when we think of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, Rachel, Bilhah, Zilpah. We also can include in the list of those important ancestors Joseph, and in that vein, King Solomon, along with, of course, King David. So when we add them to the list and include, say, Moses and Miriam and Aaron, when we add Joshua and the great judge Deborah, when we hold up Esther and we think of Mordecai, we think of those essential personalities within our tradition. So we are focused upon Joseph and King Solomon through this week's Parsha in Miketz. Yet another aspect of this week's Parsha and this week's Haftarah is the presence of Pharaoh as a force who, of course, is a ruler, but is not in as much control even of his own Egypt as Joseph is, and does not have the wisdom of King Solomon, who understands a vision, who understands his own dream, and doesn't need an interpreter, like Pharaoh of Egypt needed Joseph to solve his dreams. How does that work? That works through the language. The Haftarah begins with Vayikatz Shlomo v'hinei chalom. And Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. That language, Vayikatz, he rose up from his sleep, he ended his dreams. is shared language with this week's parsha, Vayikatz Paro v'hinei chalom. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So that parallel phrasing contrasts King Solomon having a dream and waking up and understanding that he's just been in touch with God and the divine and been gifted wisdom, versus Pharaoh, who wakes up and can't solve for himself, has no one in Egypt who can solve for his dreams, and ultimately needs Joseph to come and help him understand what he was dreaming about. In that vein, Solomon, like Joseph, is lifted as one who understands dreams. And Solomon himself knew that he could request of God one request. And famously, he asks for a lev shomea. He asks for an understanding heart, the ability to deeply listen, and that inclines him towards being the best ruler and judge that he can possibly be. Because you did not request longevity or wealth or triumph over your enemies, God says. I will grant your request for a lev shomea, for a heart of wisdom. And I will give you wisdom beyond that of any other human being. And so we, like King Solomon, we embrace that mila, that character trait, that aspect of personality and religious outlook. And we ask God, or we're encouraged to ask God for hearts of wisdom and to gain perspective on life and to be blessed with knowledge and understanding. And so along with that, we might, like King Solomon, receive that longevity or wealth or triumph over hardships and enemies that we are going to face in our lives. God makes it conditional for Solomon, just like anyone else, though, and reminds us that no king really receives everything simply because he or she is royalty or king or queen. If you follow my ways, God says, you will add longevity to your life. And of course, that endeavor to lead a holy life, to lead a life filled with gratitude, to apply wisdom discerningly, to create understandings about not only oneself, but about the world around us. As the tradition goes, Solomon knew the language of the animals and the birds. That is when we will ultimately be blessed with a life of true royalty, when we understand that we are B'nai Melech, that we are Benot Melech, we are the sons and daughters of the true King of Kings. The Haftarah goes on this week to describe that famous case where two women claim to be the mother of one live baby. And Solomon famously says, bring the sword, and the mother, who can't see the son split in two, says, save the child. And Solomon says, he, Imo, she is his mother. Solomon helps clarify for the people that life is top priority, that the application of wisdom and understanding ranks among the highest values we have. Like Yosef, he understood dreams and what must be done to help life on earth in real time unfold in holy ways. When he abused his power ultimately, and we don't forget that, Solomon ran into trouble. And in the end, he tragically died at age 52. But he was king over all of Israel. And he used his wisdom, not as king of Egypt, but as royalty among his people, Am Yisrael. And days of a unified kingdom still in our minds sit as an important and essential vision resoundingly for Am Yisrael. Despite all our divisions and distinctions, and despite our arguments and our dispositions, we hope for that unity that King Solomon represented, just like the unity that Joseph brought back to the family of Jacob, the tribes of Israel. And if it could not yet be in the land of Israel, at least it was in the land of Egypt at his time. These connections and these contrasts, this portrait that the Torah portion and the Haftarah paint, are wonderful reminders of some of the essential values of the Jewish tradition towards life, towards holiness, towards discernment, wisdom, justice, and serving our people, Am Yisrael, and the world's people who would be hungry, and using our intellectual powers to achieve positions in society that will benefit both Am Yisrael and Umot HaOlam, the nations of the world. Shabbat Shalom.